It started with a text message. One casual glance at David's phone while he showered. Something I'd never done before in our 8 years of marriage. I wasn't searching for anything. His phone buzzed repeatedly on the kitchen counter while I prepared Sunday breakfast, our weekly tradition. I only meant to silence it. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Same hotel next Thursday. My hand froze around the spatula, egg yolk dripping onto the counter. I read it 3 times, trying to find an innocent explanation. Maybe it was meant for me? No. David hadn't taken me to any hotel recently. Work colleague planning a surprise? Unlikely at 7:18 a.m. on a Sunday. I placed his phone down exactly as I'd found it, and mechanically finished cooking, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. When David entered the kitchen, hair still damp, wearing the faded Liverpool FC t-shirt I'd bought him for Christmas, I searched his face for signs. Had I missed something? Had those laugh lines around his eyes, once so endearing, become practiced deceptions? Everything all right, Emily? You look pale. He kissed my forehead casually, the familiar scent of his sandalwood soap now making my stomach turn. Fine, I managed. Just tired. The breakfast stretched into an eternity. David chatted about plans to visit his mother in Bristol next weekend, about the leak in the garden shed that needed fixing, about whether we should book that cottage in the Lake District for summer. I nodded, smiled, responded with appropriate sounds while a voice screamed inside my head. Who is she? How long has this been happening? What else don't I know? I didn't confront him that day, or the next. I told myself I needed evidence, something concrete before making accusations. But truthfully, I was terrified of hearing the confirmation aloud. Thursday arrived. David mentioned a late meeting with clients from Germany. He kissed me goodbye that morning with the same tenderness he always had. I watched him straighten his favorite blue tie, the one I'd helped him choose for his job interview at the firm 5 years ago, before heading out the door. Around 7 that evening, I parked across from the Grosvenor Hotel in Mayfair. I'd never followed anyone before. The absurdity of sitting in my 10-year-old Volkswagen, wearing sunglasses at dusk, wasn't lost on me. But there I was, heart hammering against my ribs, waiting to catch my husband walking into a hotel with another woman. At 7:43, a taxi pulled up. David stepped out, checked his watch, the vintage Omega I'd saved for months to give him on our 5th anniversary, and paid the driver. He looked around casually before entering through the revolving doors. Alone. I waited 15 more minutes, fingers gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. Then she arrived. Tall, elegant, younger than me. Her long copper hair caught the streetlight as she confidently strode into the hotel without a moment's hesitation. She knew exactly where she was going. I recognized her instantly. Rebecca Sullivan, the new marketing director at David's firm. I'd met her at the Christmas party last year. She'd complimented my dress, asked about my photography career that I'd put on hold when we moved for David's promotion. We'd laughed together at David's terrible dancing. My stomach clenched violently. I fumbled with my seatbelt, thinking I might be sick. But something kept me rooted there, staring at those revolving doors. The betrayal crystallized inside me, turning from confusion to something harder, sharper. 2 hours and 17 minutes later, they emerged. Not touching, maintaining professional distance. Careful, so careful. But I saw the satisfied flush on his cheeks, the intimate smile they exchanged before parting ways. I arrived home first, made chamomile tea I couldn't drink, and sat in our darkened living room surrounded by wedding photos and vacation mementos. When David's key turned in the lock at 10:48, I was still sitting there, motionless. Em? Why are you sitting in the dark? He flicked on the lamp, concern in his voice. I looked up at the man I'd built my life around. The safety I'd felt in his presence evaporated, leaving nothing but the hollow recognition that everything we'd shared was balanced on a foundation of lies. How was the meeting? I asked quietly. Exhausting. Germans are sticklers for detail. He loosened his tie, that blue tie, and dropped his briefcase by the door. That's funny, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. I didn't realize Rebecca Sullivan was German. David's face transformed in an instant. That practiced mask of attentive husband crumbling into shock. Then fear, then calculation. I watched emotions flicker across his features like channels being changed, until he settled on indignation. What are you talking about? Were you following me? His voice rose with manufactured outrage, as if I was the one who had committed the betrayal. Don't. The word came out sharper than I'd ever spoken to him. I saw you both. I saw everything. What followed was the predictable dance of denial, then minimizing. It was just a few times. Then blame. You've been so distant. I sat through his performance with an eerie detachment, as though watching actors in a poorly written play. The script was tired, cliché. I deserved better, even in the moment of my humiliation. Later that night, after David had retreated to the guest room, his suggestion, not mine, I stood under the shower until the water ran cold. I scrubbed every inch of my skin, as if I could wash away the years I'd spent loving a man who could lie so effortlessly. Did our vows mean anything to him? Had our life together been real at all? Sleep eluded me for days. I moved through our home like a ghost, picking up objects that suddenly felt foreign in my hands. The ceramic mug we bought in Cornwall on our honeymoon, the throw pillows we'd argued about at IKEA, the framed photograph of us in Scotland where his arms wrapped around me against the wind. Each item told a story I now questioned. Friends called, sensing something was wrong from my hollow voice and vague excuses. Just busy with work, I'd say, unable to form the words that would make it real. My husband is sleeping with another woman. My marriage is collapsing. I am not who I thought I was. David slept in the guest room for a week, then moved into a serviced apartment. To give you space, he claimed, though I knew it was to give himself freedom. The silence in the house became a living thing, pressing against my chest at night when I couldn't distract myself with meaningless tasks. My sister Kate drove up from Brighton when I finally told her. She arrived with wine, chocolate, and righteous fury. What a pathetic, selfish prick, she declared, pouring me a generous glass. You're too good for him, Em. You always were. Then why wasn't I enough? The question that had been circling my mind for weeks finally escaped. Kate put down her glass. This has nothing to do with you being enough. This is about David being a coward who couldn't honor his commitments. But I gave up so much, I whispered. My photography business that was just taking off when we moved to London. The gallery showing I'd been offered, but declined because it conflicted with David's company retreat that spouses were expected to attend. The baby discussions we'd postponed year after year because the timing was never right for his career. My identity had become so entangled with his that I couldn't remember where Emily ended and David's wife began. Who was I without him? The question terrified me. Kate stayed the weekend, helping me sort through practicalities. She contacted a solicitor friend who specialized in divorce. She accompanied me to the bank to open an account in just my name. Small steps toward independence that felt monumental. When she left, the silence returned, but it felt different, less suffocating, more contemplative. I wandered through my home, considering what to keep, what to discard. In the study, I found my old camera equipment gathering dust in the back of the closet. I lifted my Canon, wiping fingerprints from the lens, remembering how it once felt like an extension of myself. On a whim, I took it to the small park near our house. It was a dreary Tuesday in March, the kind of chilly, damp day Londoners are accustomed to enduring. I found myself photographing ordinary moments. An elderly man feeding pigeons, 2 schoolgirls sharing an umbrella, a barista arranging pastries in a cafe window. Through the viewfinder, the world regained some of its color. That evening, reviewing the images on my laptop, I realized I'd captured something I hadn't seen in weeks. Life continuing. People connecting, working, existing in ways large and small. My world had stopped when I discovered David's betrayal, but everyone else's had carried on. The photos weren't particularly good. I was rusty, my timing off, but they were mine, created by my eye, my hands, a piece of myself reclaimed from the wreckage of my marriage. When David called that night, his voice conciliatory, suggesting we talk things through, I surprised us both with my response. I don't think I have anything left to say to you. April arrived with unexpected warmth, as if the weather was apologizing for the harshness of winter. I'd taken to walking each morning through Holland Park, camera slung around my neck like an old friend. My therapist, Dr. Winters, a practical woman with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense approach, had suggested establishing routines that were solely mine, untouched by memories of David. "Morning walks," she'd said during our third session. 7 o'clock, before your mind has time to spiral. I'd resisted initially. Mornings had never been my strength, but found myself craving the stillness of the park before the city fully awakened. The rhythmic click of my camera shutter became meditative, grounding me in the present when my thoughts threatened to drag me back into the quicksand of what-ifs and if-onlys. Emily Wilson? I was photographing cherry blossoms when a familiar voice pulled me from my concentration. I turned to find James Bennett, my university photography professor, walking his border terrier on a worn leather leash. "Professor Bennett," I smiled, genuinely pleased to see the man who'd once told me I had the eye during my final year critique. "James, please, I haven't been your professor for a decade." He glanced at my camera. "Still shooting?" "Again," I corrected. "I'm shooting again." We ended up at a cafe near the park entrance, his dog Rusty contentedly snoozing under the table. James had retired from teaching 2 years ago, but ran a small gallery in Notting Hill, featuring emerging photographers. Mostly young upstarts from Central St. Martin's, he explained, stirring his tea. "But I keep a wall for photographers whose work speaks to me, people with something genuine to say." I found myself telling him about the past months. Not all the raw details, but enough. About rediscovering my camera. About needing to remember who I was beyond someone's wife. "Bring me your portfolio," he said when we parted. "The old work, the new work, all of it." I almost didn't. What portfolio? I had scattered images, no cohesive vision, but Kate's voice echoed in my head. What's the worst that could happen? So I gathered what I had, including the recent park series, and visited his gallery the following week. James spent an hour reviewing my work in silence, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of appreciation. My anxiety mounted with each passing minute. "You've changed," he finally said, removing his reading glasses. "Your earlier work was technically flawless but safe. These new images," he tapped the park series. "There's vulnerability here. Humanity. They're messy but honest." He offered me a spot in a summer exhibition, featuring photographers documenting London's quiet moments. It wasn't a solo show or a prestigious gallery, but it was something real. Something that acknowledged the artist I was becoming rather than the one I'd left behind. The divorce proceedings moved forward with clinical efficiency. David didn't contest anything, perhaps out of guilt or simply wanting it over quickly. Rebecca had been transferred to the firm's Manchester office. Whether by choice or consequence, I never asked. My solicitor, a shrewd woman named Priya, negotiated terms that allowed me to keep the London flat. "He's paying for his dalliance," she noted dryly when the settlement was finalized. I found I didn't care much about the financial details. What mattered was the paperwork that would officially end the chapter of my life labeled David's wife. On the day I signed the final papers, I walked home through a sudden spring shower. Londoners scurried for cover, umbrellas blooming like black flowers against the gray sky. I kept walking, letting the rain soak through my clothes. Not out of melodrama, but because I wanted to feel everything. The discomfort, the cold, the relief, the uncertainty. After months of numbness, even discomfort felt like progress. At home, I hung my dripping coat and noticed the blinking light on my answering machine. James's voice filled the room. "Emily, Miranda Peters canceled for the October slot at the gallery. It's yours if you want it. A solo exhibition. Call me." I stood dripping on the hardwood floors, water pooling around my feet, as the enormity of the opportunity washed over me. October. 6 months to create a cohesive body of work that represented not just my eye, but my voice, my story. For the first time since that Sunday morning when I'd glimpsed the text message that shattered my world, I felt something like excitement flutter in my chest. Not happiness exactly. That seemed too foreign still. But possibility. A door opening where I'd only seen walls. I took a long shower, letting the warm water replace the cold rain, and then wrapped myself in the plush robe I'd bought during my recent Purge the Past shopping trip with Kate. Sitting at my kitchen table, I began listing potential themes for the exhibition, possible locations to shoot, equipment I would need. Halfway through, I realized I was smiling. A small, tentative smile, but genuine, the kind that starts from within, rather than being manufactured for others' benefit. My phone pinged with a text from David. Signed everything today. Hope you're doing well. I looked at his name on my screen, remembering how my heart once leapt at his messages. Now I felt only a dull ache, like pressing on a bruise that had begun to heal. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned back to my exhibition notes and wrote at the top of the page, "Becoming. Portraits of a woman in progress." Summer bloomed across London in waves of unexpected heat. I spent my days chasing light through the city. Dawn at Columbia Road Flower Market, midday in the shifting shadows of St. Dunstan in the east, dusk along the South Bank, where tourists and locals alike gathered to watch the Thames turn golden. My exhibition deadline loomed like both promise and threat, pushing me to places I might otherwise have avoided, including one sweltering July afternoon, my old neighborhood in Hackney, where David and I had rented our first flat together. I hadn't planned to go there. My feet simply carried me down familiar streets until I stood before the red brick building where we'd started our London life, arguing about furniture arrangements and learning each other's morning rhythms. I lifted my camera almost defensively, as if viewing the past through my lens might protect me from its pull. Click. The chipped blue door. Click. The window box where my herbs always died because the ledge got too little sun. Click. The corner cafe where David would bring me cappuccinos on Sunday mornings, foam artfully shaped into hearts. "That's someone's home you're photographing," a voice said behind me. I turned to find an elderly woman watching me suspiciously. Shopping trolley paused beside her. "It used to be mine," I replied. Something in my expression must have communicated the rest, because her face softened. "Ah, memories aren't always kind visitors, are they, love?" I lowered my camera. "No, but sometimes they need to be faced." Those photos became the foundation of my exhibition, not because they captured the building itself, but because when I developed them, I saw something unexpected in the composition. I'd unconsciously framed each shot to exclude certain elements. The doorbell where David's name once appeared beside mine, the tree where he'd kissed me during our first snowfall in London, the corner where he'd hailed the taxi on the night he proposed. I had photographed the pieces of home I could still claim as solely mine. The revelation shifted something fundamental in my approach. I began revisiting places from my past deliberately, not just with David, but earlier. The university darkroom where I'd first watched my images materialize in chemical baths. The Southwark Cafe where I'd landed my first photography assignment. The hospital bench where I'd sat after my father's heart attack, capturing how light filtered through half-closed blinds onto sterile floors. Each location became a reclamation project. Each photograph, a step toward seeing my life as a continuous journey rather than a narrative bifurcated into before and after David. My small flat transformed into a working studio. I covered walls with prints, mapping connections between images that might not be obvious to anyone else but told a story I needed to understand. Kate visited one weekend and stood silently in the middle of my organized chaos. "It's like seeing inside your head," she finally said, studying the chronology I'd created. Beautiful and a bit terrifying. James checked in regularly, offering technical advice and exhibition logistics, but never trying to influence my creative direction. "This is your story to tell," he insisted, when I asked if a particular series was too personal. "The question is whether you're ready for others to hear it." Was I? Some days I wasn't sure. I'd look at images of myself reflected in windows or shadows stretched across familiar places, and wonder if I was exploiting my own pain for art. Other days, the work felt like the most honest thing I'd ever created. Raw in places, certainly, but authentic in a way my earlier photography had never been. In August, I hit a creative wall. The initial urgency had faded, leaving me staring at images that suddenly seemed indulgent and cliché. Who cared about my journey of self-discovery? Wasn't every divorce story essentially the same? I called James in a panic, ready to withdraw from the exhibition. "Come to the gallery," he said, his voice calm against my rising anxiety. "Bring everything. Every single image." I arrived sweaty and disheveled, carrying portfolios and loose prints. James cleared the back room and helped me lay everything out on the floor, tables, even a few chairs. For hours, we moved images around, creating new groupings, finding conversations between photographs taken months apart. "Look," he said finally, gesturing toward the constellation we'd created. "This isn't just about your divorce. It's about how we carry places within us, how locations hold emotional memory." He pointed to a triptych. My childhood bedroom window photographed during a visit to my mother's house. The view from my university dormitory captured on a nostalgic campus walk. The bay window of my current flat at dawn. Spider plants silhouetted against rising light. "Windows," I murmured, seeing the thread he'd identified. "Thresholds," he corrected. "Places of transition. Entrances and exits. You've been documenting boundaries your entire career, Emily. The divorce just brought it into focus." I left the gallery that day with renewed clarity and a title for my exhibition: Thresholds, Navigating the Spaces Between. The text arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in September, 3 weeks before my exhibition opening. I was in Covent Garden, photographing a series on public intimacy, the small ways strangers navigate shared spaces. My phone buzzed against my hip. I need to collect the last of my things from the flat. Would Thursday work? David. My stomach clenched with familiar tension. In the months since signing the divorce papers, we'd communicated through solicitors and brief practical texts. I'd boxed most of his remaining possessions: books, winter clothes, the vintage record collection he'd been so proud of, but had deliberately avoided the study, where his presence lingered most strongly. Thursday, 6 p.m. I won't be home. Key is with Mrs. Winters next door. I typed and sent before I could overthink it. His response came immediately. "I'd rather see you. We should talk." I lowered my camera, watching a street performer juggle flaming torches while tourists gasped on cue. 6 months ago, those words would have cracked my carefully constructed composure. Now they simply existed, like weather I could observe without being drenched by. Nothing left to say. 6 p.m. Mrs. Winters. I resumed shooting, but my concentration was broken. The thought of David moving through my space, the home I'd reconfigured to reflect only myself, felt like an intrusion. I'd replaced the sofa where we'd spent countless evenings, painted the bedroom a deep teal he would have hated, rearranged the kitchen to suit my cooking habits rather than his. But the study remained a half-finished project, still containing ghosts I hadn't fully exorcised. Thursday morning, I woke determined to complete what I'd been avoiding. I cleared his desk of papers, old receipts, the fountain pen I'd given him one Christmas. I cataloged everything meticulously, placing items in labeled boxes with the same care I'd give to archiving photographs. No emotion, just process. When I reached the bottom drawer, I hesitated. This had been where David kept personal items. Cards I'd given him, ticket stubs from concerts we'd attended, the small mementos of our shared life. I'd never looked inside during our marriage, respecting his private space as he'd respected mine. Now, my hand hovered over the handle. The divorce was final. These items legally belonged to him, but something pulled me forward. Not suspicion or bitterness, but a need for completion. I opened the drawer. It contained what I expected: birthday cards, vacation souvenirs, the pressed boutonniere from our wedding. But beneath these, I found something unexpected. A leather portfolio I recognized as mine, one I'd believed lost during our move to London. Inside were prints from my early career, reviews of my first exhibition in Brighton, a feature about emerging photographers that had included my work. My hands trembled slightly. David had kept these? The same man who'd subtly discouraged my ambitions, who'd framed my career as a hobby rather than a calling. He'd secretly preserved evidence of my talent. I was still sitting on the study floor, surrounded by his belongings and this strange discovery, when the doorbell rang 3 hours early. I knew before opening it that David had ignored my boundaries once again. He stood in the hallway looking both familiar and foreign. His hair was shorter, his frame slightly leaner. He wore a navy jumper I didn't recognize. "You're early," I said flatly. I got away from work sooner than expected. His eyes moved past me, surveying the changes to the flat. "You've been redecorating." "Living," I corrected. "I've been living here." An awkward silence stretched between us. Once I would have rushed to fill it, to ease his discomfort. Now I simply waited. "Can I come in?" "The boxes might take a few trips. I stepped aside, suddenly aware of how different I must appear to him. My hair was shorter too, cut into a bob that framed my face more boldly. I'd lost the softness that had come from years of comfortable domesticity. My body felt more defined, not just physically but energetically, as if I occupied space more deliberately now. "The boxes are in the study," I said, leading him through the flat. He followed, his footsteps hesitant on the hardwood floors that were no longer his to traverse freely. In the study, his eyes immediately fell on the open drawer, the leather portfolio, the scattered contents of his private collection. "You went through my things." Not a question, but not quite an accusation either. "I was packing," I replied. "I found my portfolio. The one you said must have been lost in the move." David had the decency to look embarrassed. "I should have given that back to you. Why did you keep it?" He moved to the window, always his habit when uncomfortable, seeking escape in the view outside rather than confronting what lay before him. "Because you were brilliant," he said finally. "Those photographs showed who you really were, who you could become. The career you encouraged me to set aside," I said, keeping my voice steady. He turned back to me, his expression a complex mixture of regret and defensiveness. "That's not fair, Emily. You agreed to those decisions. We made them together. Did we? Or did I just stop arguing because it was easier to shrink myself than to constantly justify my ambitions?" The question hung between us, unanswerable in any satisfying way. David's gaze fell on a large print leaning against the wall, one of my recent pieces showing a woman's silhouette reflected in fragmented mirror shards. "Is this for your exhibition?" James mentioned it when we ran into each other. The casual reference to James, my connection, my opportunity, sent a flash of irritation through me. Of course they'd encountered each other. London's art world was small, and David had always been skilled at maintaining useful networks. "Yes," I said simply. "It opens in 3 weeks." David nodded, studying the image with genuine attention. "It's powerful. Different from your earlier work. More exposed." I felt suddenly protective of my creation, unwilling to share its meaning with him. This new work had grown from his betrayal, yes, but it had become something entirely mine, something he had no right to analyze or approve. "The boxes are there," I said, redirecting his attention. "I need to leave for a shoot in 30 minutes. The lie came easily, a boundary drawn in clear terms. David looked as if he might say more, but instead nodded and reached for the first box. "I'm glad you're photographing again," he said as he lifted it. "You deserve this exhibition." I watched him carry pieces of our past out the door, surprised to find I felt nothing but a quiet certainty. His approval, once so desperately sought, now meant absolutely nothing to me at all. Rain pattered against the gallery windows, creating shifting patterns of light across the polished concrete floor. I stood in the center of the space, surrounded by my work. 28 photographs arranged in careful sequence, each a fragment of the journey that had brought me here. In 3 hours, the empty room would fill with people coming to see not just art, but pieces of my soul rendered visible. Nervous? James appeared beside me, offering a cup of tea in one of the gallery's minimalist white mugs. Terrified, I admitted, accepting the warm cup gratefully, but not in the way I expected. I'd anticipated fear of judgment, critics dismissing my work, visitors misunderstanding my intentions. Instead, I felt vulnerable in a more fundamental way. These images revealed truths I was still learning to articulate: how places retain emotional imprints, how the act of seeing can be both wound and healing, how we carry thresholds within us long after crossing them. "That's good," James nodded. "The terror means you've made something honest." We spent the final hours adjusting lighting, arranging wine glasses, checking that each photograph hung perfectly level. My sister Kate arrived early with a garment bag containing the emerald green jumpsuit we'd found in a vintage shop off Portobello Road. "Something old made new," she'd declared when I tried it on. "Like you." In the small back office that doubled as tonight's dressing room, I transformed myself from the work clothes photographer into someone who could stand confidently beside her creations. Kate twisted my hair into an elegant knot, while I applied makeup with more care than I had in months. "David called me," she said casually, securing a final pin. My hand stilled on the lipstick tube. What did he want? To know if you'd mind him attending tonight. Said he saw the exhibition listing and wanted to support your work. She met my eyes in the mirror. I told him to saw it off, obviously, but thought you should know he might show up anyway. I considered how the possibility made me feel. Not anger or anxiety, but something more complex. A blend of indifference and curiosity. Who was I now to the man who had once been the center of my world? What would he see when he looked at these images born from the wreckage he'd created? It doesn't matter, I decided aloud. This night isn't about him. Damn right it isn't. Kate squeezed my shoulders. It's about Emily Wilson, the brilliant photographer everyone's about to discover. By 7, the gallery hummed with voices. Former university classmates I'd reconnected with, friends who'd supported me through the divorce, colleagues from my freelance projects, critics James had personally invited. I moved through conversations in a state of heightened awareness, watching faces as they encountered my work. Near the entrance hung the earliest pieces, stark architectural studies of doorways and windows from my past. The middle section featured reflections and shadows, figures partially obscured or fragmented. The final wall displayed the most recent works, self-portraits of sorts, though rarely showing my full face. Instead, they captured parts of me in relation to significant spaces. Hands gripping a ferry railing returning from my childhood home, feet dangling from the riverbank where I'd spent countless lunch breaks during my first London job, shoulders silhouetted against the dawn light in my bedroom. There's such intimacy in these. A woman in her 60s studied a photograph of my shadow stretched across the steps of the National Gallery, as if we're witnessing something private that's been deliberately shared. I was explaining my technique when I felt a shift in the energy of the room. Without turning, I knew. David had arrived. He stood by the entrance, hair slightly damp from the rain, looking uncertain in a way I'd rarely seen during our marriage. Our eyes met across the crowded space. He nodded once, respectfully, then turned his attention to the nearest photograph. I excused myself from the conversation and continued circulating, deliberately moving in the opposite direction. This pattern continued for nearly an hour, David and I orbiting each other without intersection, him viewing my work with careful attention, me watching him peripherally while engaging with other guests. It was James who eventually brought us face to face, unknowingly guiding a prominent gallery owner toward me, just as David was studying a photograph nearby. Emily, this is Margot Levine from the Pembroke Gallery. Margot, our featured artist, Emily Wilson. As we shook hands, David moved a step away, but Margot noticed him. Are you also a photographer? She asked politely. A flash of discomfort crossed his face. No, I'm my ex-husband. I finished simply, the words feeling strangely weightless. An awkward beat passed before Margot nodded. I see. Well, you must be proud of what Emily has accomplished. David looked directly at me then, his expression open in a way it hadn't been even during our marriage. I am, though I can't claim any credit for it. The honesty in his voice surprised me. No passive-aggressive undertone, no subtle diminishment. Just recognition. The exhibition is remarkable, he added, addressing both Margot and me. Particularly the triptych in the corner. He referred to 3 images I'd taken of the same park bench. One in winter before our separation, one in spring during the divorce proceedings, one in summer after everything was finalized. The progression showed not just seasonal change, but a shifting perspective, from distance to intimacy, from isolation to integration with the surrounding environment. Thank you, I said, meaning it. If you'll excuse me, I should speak with some other guests. As I moved away, I felt a curious lightness. David had seen my work that had grown from the pain he caused, and recognized its value. Not that his validation mattered, but there was a symmetry to it that felt right, the circle completing itself. The evening continued in a blur of conversations, congratulations, and quietly thrilling moments. A respected critic spending 20 minutes with a single photograph. A museum curator slipping me her card. James reporting that 3 pieces had already sold. Near closing, Kate found me by the wine table, cheeks flushed with excitement and pride. You did it, Em. You absolutely bloody did it. It feels unreal, I admitted, surveying the room where my vision hung on every wall. A year ago, I couldn't imagine this. A year ago, You were still trying to be who he wanted, she said, nodding toward the door where David was slipping out quietly. Look at you now. I watched him go, feeling neither loss nor triumph, just a peaceful awareness that our stories had diverged. He was heading into the rainy London night, and I was standing in a room filled with evidence of my resurrection. Later, after the last guests had departed and James was locking up, I walked slowly around the empty gallery. Each image marked a step in my journey, from the woman who had sat stunned in a darkened living room waiting for her husband to return from another woman's bed, to the artist who had transformed that pain into something meaningful. I paused before the final photograph, one I'd taken just weeks ago. It showed my hand reaching toward a door, not quite touching the handle. The focus was soft on my fingers, but sharp on what lay beyond. Sunlight, open space, possibility. The title card beside it read simply, "Forward."